Today I'd like to begin a discussion of the mammals of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And what defines mammals, there are several characteristics, but characteristics of mammals include that they have a four-chambered heart, evolved in a different way than birds, but a four-chambered heart, that as a result they are endothermic homeotherms, at least most of them are. They're all endothermic, they're not necessarily all homeotherms, but most are. They will have a product of the skin, which is either hair or fur, and so they have a keratinized skin. And then really a unique feature for mammals is that they have mammary glands, these milk-producing glands. And the young will feed on milk for at least a portion of their lives. And then also mammals have unique middle ear bones. When you compare mammal middle ear bones, say, to reptiles, reptiles have a single bone in the middle ear, whereas mammals have three bones in the middle ear, the malleus, incus, and stapes. And so that is a characteristic also unique to mammals in addition to having mammary glands. And then also another characteristic of mammals compared to reptiles is that they are heterodontic. And what that means is that they have different types of teeth. Hetero means different, dontic is a reference to teeth. Reptiles are homodontic. And so when we talked about birds, I told you that if you look at the beak and the feet of a bird, that will tell you a lot about what it does in an ecosystem. Its niche in the ecosystem, rather. And when we look at mammals, really when you look at the teeth, the so-called dentition of mammals, we can get a pretty good idea of what they're doing in that ecosystem. So if we look at mammal teeth then, and when I say heterodontic, what I mean is that within a single mouth we can have different types of teeth. And so typically what we see in a mammal mouth then would be incisors. And I'll come back to this in a second, but incisors have what we call one cusp or one point. Canines. And when we look at embryonic development of teeth in the jaw, upper or lower jaw, they start off basically with what we call a tooth bud, basically kind of a ridge of bone or a point of bone. And so in the case of incisors then, incisors will form from a single tooth bud. And then canines also form from one cusp. And canines, whereas incisors are normally used for clipping, canines are usually pointed teeth that are used for piercing. And I'll show you an example in just a second. Premolars we generally find more towards the back of the mouth, and they form from two or three cusps. So again, as we look at embryonic development, this would be a side view here, and here's a top view of the teeth. And so what happens here is that we would have two or three of these tooth buds forming, and then as the tooth develops, those tooth buds fuse together to form one tooth. So this is effectively, if you look at this as kind of a developmental mutation that's occurred in the mammals that allowed what would have been individual teeth to fuse together to form a single tooth. So again, this would be a side view, this would be a top view. So that's what we see in premolars. And most of the time premolars are used for grinding or shearing. And then molars typically form from 4 or 5 cusps, or have 4 or 5 cusps, meaning that they start off as 4 or 5 tooth buds, and again a side view here and a top view, and then they will fuse together to form a single tooth. So just to give you an idea then of what this heterodonty looks like, this is a lower jaw of a javelina, and there certainly are no javelinas in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but it was a nice skull that I had, so I thought I would use it. So as we look at this jaw then, again, we see different types of teeth in the jaw. So these would be the incisors here in front. Here's a look at the canine. And then we have premolars and molars. And so you can see the premolars and molars are mostly about grinding. This canine would be for defense or piercing. And then again, the incisors primarily for clipping. So different types of mammals will have modifications of these teeth. Again, usually incisors are clipping, canines for stabbing, but there can be some variations here, and there can be quite a few variations among premolars and molars. So javelinas are fairly omnivorous, and this is a typical dentition of an omnivore. And then also just to contrast that, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see this, but when you look at, this is the lower jaw of a beaver, you can see here that the molars look quite a bit different. They have little ridges on them, and this is real typical of the molars and premolars of an herbivorous mammal. So again, by looking at the nature of the teeth, not just what teeth are there, but also modifications in those teeth, we can get a pretty good idea of what a particular mammal was doing in its ecosystem, or is doing in its ecosystem. Now, following this up, then one of the features that's used then to classify mammals is what we call the dentition. So if you were to look at the skull, if you were to take it at the midline, if you were to look at the teeth right in the midline and then work laterally and posteriorly, the order of the teeth is that you will have incisors, then canines, then premolars and molars. And so what we do is we'll take one quadrant, one upper quadrant, and one lower quadrant. We'll identify the different types of teeth there, and we refer to that as the dentition. So in the case of humans, for example, if you start at our midline and work laterally, work to the side and posteriorly, our dentition is 2, 1, 2, 3, over 2, 1, 2, 3. And so the 2 here represents incisors. So if you start at the midline and work laterally, we have 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. And we happen to have the same dentition in the upper jaw and in the lower jaw. That's not always the case in all mammals, but that is our particular case. And so this would be our adult dentition. Now, in addition to that, mammals usually produce deciduous teeth or milk teeth that they use while nursing, and then also in infancy or childhood, and then those usually fall out as the permanent teeth grow in. So you may have one dentition for the milk teeth and another dentition for the permanent teeth. Now, as we look at the class Mammalia, there are 3 subclasses. One subclass are the monotremes. Those are the egg-laying mammals, and there are certainly none of those in the Yellowstone ecosystem. They're restricted to Australia and related islands. But they are interesting because there are still some egg-laying mammals. A lot of people, when they define mammals, always say that they bear live young. Not all of them do. The monotremes lay eggs. In North America, and so this would be an example. The echidna, also the duck-billed platypus would be an example of it. Subclass Marsupialia, so the marsupials and the eutherians are both placental mammals. And in North America, there's only one marsupial, and that's the opossum. And certainly there are opossums around the Yellowstone ecosystem. I've read some conflicting reports as to whether they're actually found in Yellowstone National Park. But certainly in the agricultural areas around the ecosystem, you will find some opossums. But certainly not common. And so the dominant group then would be the eutheria. And also I should mention that the opossum, the marsupials then are the pouched mammals. So the eutherians are the so-called true placentals. They dominate Earth, they certainly dominate North America. And as we look at the placenta then is kind of an interesting organ because it is a temporary organ. It's carried for the pregnancy and then it will be dislodged and forced out of the uterus. And then also it's a dual organ. It's composed of tissue of both the developing fetus as well as the mother's tissue. So it's composed of tissue from 2 different individuals. It's also a temporary organ. And so that becomes the interface for the mother and the child, and that's where nutrients, gases, and wastes are exchanged. So as we look at a diagrammatic representation of the placenta, we find the same types of membranes in the placenta, or associated with placenta, as we do with the amniote egg. And the placenta evolved from amniote eggs. So we have an amniotic membrane that produces an amniotic fluid, and that will act as a cushioning agent for the developing embryo. And then there's a vestigial yolk sac. Mammals don't have a yolk, but they do produce a vestigial yolk sac, which eventually becomes some connective tissue to support the umbilical cord. They also produce an allantoic membrane, which will be highly vascular. That's what grows into the uterine lining and creates the interface between maternal and fetal bloodstreams. And then additionally, there's an outer membrane called the chorion, which is another protective membrane, and that also will be growing into the uterus of the female and forming part of the placenta. So, in most mammalia placenta then, you're not going to have mixing of maternal and, in fact, you're not going to have mixing of maternal and fetal blood, but you do have an interface for gas, nutrient, and waste exchange. All right, now as we look at different orders of eutherians, the first one I want to discuss are the Artiodactyla. The prefix artio means even. Dactyla is a reference to toes. So these are the even-toed hooved mammals. And in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there are a lot of these, and some of these are quite large. And so these are actually elk hooves, to give you a sense of this. And this is an elk lower leg, and so we can see the 2 hooves here, the 2 toes, the even hooves here. And again, they are part of the food chain, and the reason I have these 2 pictures in is to emphasize that they are kind of low in the food chain. They're usually herbivores, and then the carnivores are feeding on them. And the Artiodactylans that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem also belong to a suborder, the ruminants, the ruminantia. And the rumen is a modified stomach. It has 4 chambers associated with it, the rumen being one of those. And it's basically a fermentation chamber. And as I talked about previously in the course, it's within this rumen then that the ruminants will have bacteria and protozoa that can digest cellulose. So you may recall that animals cannot digest cellulose, but microorganisms can. So in this fermentation vat then, as the animals, bison, elk, deer, and so on, as they eat the grasses, they ferment in this rumen. The microorganisms will digest the cellulose. And one of the things that ruminants typically do is that they will periodically regurgitate the food, chew it up more to increase surface area, and they're quote-unquote chew their cud. So with a lot of these animals, elk, deer, bison, and so on, a lot of times you see them relaxing, laying around, but they'll be chewing constantly, so they're chewing that cud, increasing that surface area. And then they'll move that material into the intestine so that it can be digested. But if you were to sterilize their intestine, they will effectively starve to death because we do not produce the enzymes that will digest, or we mammals do not produce the enzymes that will digest cellulose. Now, as we look at the Artiodactyla in this ecosystem, the hoofed mammals, some will have horns and some will have antlers. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the difference between horns and antlers. So I'll start off with horns. And so as we look at this skull of a goat, horns have a core of bone. It's true bone. And so the horn will grow the life of the animal. So these are extensions of the frontal bone. And then external to that, of course, there'll be skin. And so there's a sheath that covers the bone. And we can see that here on this bighorn sheep horns. And anyway, this is a product of the skin. So it depends on the animal, but it can be kind of the texture of your fingernails. So this is keratinized skin product. So it can be hard and kind of not bony, but hard and compact like our fingernails. In some, it will be more like a compressed hair. So in the case of the pronghorn, it's not quite the same as this. And in some, the horns will be shed periodically. For example, the pronghorn actually sheds the sheath periodically, not the horn, but the sheath can be shed annually in the case of the pronghorns. But most horned animals then will not shed this sheath very frequently. So the horn is ever growing, the horn is not shed, but in some species this outer covering will be shed periodically. Now that contrasts with antlers. Antlers are temporary structures. They will be grown through the summer and then used for creating a harem or battling for females or for defense. So the antlers will grow through the summer. They're basically cartilaginous and relatively soft initially. You can see that they're covered with fur, and that's known as velvet. Here's a moose. Moose have what we call palmate antlers, but you can see again that they're quite furry looking. And so as the summer progresses, here we have a mule deer again, also in velvet. So what happens then as the summer progresses is that the blood vessels leading to the skin initially begin to constrict, and that fur and skin will begin to die and it peels off, and so that's uncomfortable, kind of itchy for the animal, and so it will start to rub its horns on shrubbery and on trees, remove that skin, and then actually the outer core of the outer portion of the antler will begin to die as blood vessels constrict. The nerves going into that then will deaden, and then the animals begin to rub their horns on trees and so on to kind of compress that material. They'll polish their antlers, and I think I said horns, so antlers here is what we're talking about. And so as they move into the fall then, effectively the antlers are dead for all purposes. They may have a little bit of blood supply in the center of the antler, but they're pretty much dead at that point. And then that's when they start jousting and fighting over females. And then they'll also be mating in the fall as well. And then as you move into winter, the antlers become a liability at that point. And so as we look at this deer skull here, you can see that there's what we call a pedicel, kind of a base for the antler. And so chemicals will be produced at the base of the antlers, digest away the antler, and eventually the antler falls off during the winter months. And then in spring, you have new vegetation, fresh vegetation. The process starts over again, and the antlers will begin to grow. So generally with each season, the antlers get larger with each season, and more points are added. But it's not necessarily 1 point per year, as some people think, or one tine per year. Now, as we look at the Yellowstone ecosystem, we have two types of deer in the Yellowstone ecosystem. There's mule deer and white-tailed deer. The mule deer is much more common. And so one of the ways to tell them apart is by looking at the antlers. So when we look at the mule deer, the antlers will typically form a Y kind of shape like this. And if there are additional tines, they also will come off of a Y kind of shape like this. And so again, you count the tines, or count what are known as the points, and some people combine those to give a total number of points when they look at a buck, and these would be growing in the males. And some will just count one antler, so it just depends what your preference is. And so again, these would be examples of pretty classic mule deer antlers. Now, and also another characteristic of the mule deer is that on the tail, when you look at the tail of the mule deer, because there's going to be quite a variation in color. Mule deer can be anything from gray to kind of this buff color that we're seeing here. But also they typically will either have a black tip on the tail, or running down the tail there'll be a black stripe. And so when you go up into this area, there's a lot of black-tail this, black-tail that, and that's a reference to mule deers. Now, when you look at the antlers of the white-tailed deer, you'll have a central antler and then tines coming off of that. So at the top you'll certainly have your Y, but it's a different type of antler, and it's pretty distinctive when you see that. And then also the white-tailed deer has a really distinctive white tail when it's running away, and very white rump that's quite distinctive and different from mule deer. So white-tailed deer are not nearly as common in the ecosystem as mule deer. Another major artiodactylan ungulate ruminant in the ecosystem would be elk. They're physically huge, and there are a lot of them. So you can see the massive antlers that they carry. There are a couple of males. And we find them throughout the ecosystem. And one of the problems for elk historically in the ecosystem has been that they were migratory animals. And so they would spend the winters in the Yellowstone area, or excuse me, the summers in the Yellowstone area, and in the winter they would try to migrate out of the area, migrate to the south. But as development occurred, and here when I talk about development, I'm really talking about rural development, as farms were established and so on, this really cut off the historic migratory routes for the elk. And so lots of elk were dying in the winters as Yellowstone area became more popular. So anyway, to mitigate this then, and to counteract this, managers began feeding elk, back in the early 1900s. And eventually the National Elk Refuge was established just to the south of Grand Teton National Park. And so this is the primary winter feeding ground for elk. And as we look at the National Elk Refuge, again, this would be Teton Park here. Again, National Elk Refuge is just south of that then. So members of what we call the southern herd of the Yellowstone herd, and then also down into the Teton area, will make their way down to the National Elk Refuge. And there's forage there for them, but it has to be augmented typically with hay. And this is not the only feeding zone in the ecosystem, but this is one of the major feeding systems, certainly on the southern end of the range. So really, the ecosystem cannot support the elk that are there. There's just not enough winter forage for them. They're not really built for winter. They're supposed to be migrating out of the area to lower elevations to survive the winter, but they can no longer do that, and so managers have, for decades now, many decades, been feeding the elk to maintain that population. So the elk population is somewhat of an artificial population because we're feeding them. So again, here is the National Elk Refuge highlighted here. Now, there are problems with this, and when we look at this in terms of an ecological perspective, we ideally are going to be managing the national parks and wilderness and so on using natural means of control of populations. But we do have this precedent of feeding elk, and as a result, elk numbers are artificially large, and this is a good thing if you're a hunter. Hunters like lots of elk. And there's a lot of hunters that come into this area, and it's a big part of the fall economy. In Wyoming alone, for example, last year there were, I think, 23,000, I think it was 21,000 elk that were killed through hunting. So again, this is a big part of the economy. So the science might say, or the ecology or the ethic might say, let's try to naturally control elk numbers. And if you're going to do that, you would probably not want to feed them in winter or feed them less. Whereas hunters want to have lots of elk, and so they want to feed them. However, when you concentrate elk, you're going to also introduce disease. When you concentrate animals, that makes it easier for disease to be spread. And so, interestingly now, hunters and ecologists are beginning to come to kind of a consensus that maybe it's not a good idea to be concentrating elk because there are some real concerns about disease. So the major elk diseases and areas of concern, one would be brucellosis, and I'm going to talk about brucellosis quite a bit when we discuss bison in a little while. And brucellosis is problematic because when brucellosis gets into cattle, it causes them to abort their fetus, and usually it's an abortion of the first fetus. And so that will also happen in elk, and so this is potentially problematic for the herd. Now, of greater concern, as we talked about earlier in the course when we talked about prion disease, is chronic wasting disease. So chronic wasting disease has recently appeared in the ecosystem, and if you're going to be concentrating elk, that's going to increase the spread of chronic wasting disease, and so that potentially could be devastating to the herd. Also, if you have hunters that are eating prion-infected animals, potentially this is something that could jump to humans. So there's the potential for human concern as well. And then really a lesser concern, but it's certainly part of it, is what we call hoof rot. And so this is actually a bacterial disorder. It's not one I'd mentioned earlier. There's two species here, Bacteroides and Fusobacterium. And these are gram-negative anaerobic bacteria. And so these get basically are found in the intestine, but when you have lots of elk, they're defecating all over the place. This can get wedged up in between their toes, between their hooves, and then this can cause infections and potentially be fatal because it can make the animal lame. It makes them easier to predate. If they can't migrate back up into the parts of the park where they're normally found, they may also die or just starve. So another aspect of concentrating elk is that if you're going to be feeding the elk, the bison are going to learn about this as well. So another concern is that bison and elk can also be trading disease back and forth, and they also in some cases overlap range with cattle, and so the economic concern in the area is then that the disease is also going to be transmitted to cattle. So there are a few areas here in terms of the economics. You want to maintain a large elk herd for the hunters. You also want to protect the ranchers who have cattle, and bison are just kind of in the link here. Now, bison then would be another major player physically in the ecosystem. Bison, when you're traveling through the ecosystem, it seems like there are a lot of them, but compared to elk, there are relatively few. So when we look at the ecosystem, there's somewhere between 45 and 65,000 elk, and there's only about 5,000 bison in the Yellowstone ecosystem, at least currently, sometimes less than that, and about 1,100 right now in the Teton area, in the Teton herd. So they seem to be much more numerous than they actually are when you're actually in the ecosystem, but they are incredibly impressive animals. And for my money, really, they're the most dangerous animal in the ecosystem. Bison are really hard to read. The males can be quite aggressive, and they're just strange. The bachelors, when they're out on their own, they're just hard to read, and you just never know what they're going to do. So what was striking, I think, about bison when you see them is that head, that massive head. It's a pile driver. It's really an adaptation to the winter so that they can drive through the snow. And you can see that they do have true horns, and that's a problem if you ever have one that's going to be aggressive with you. And annually, again, people worry about bears, but really annually it's the bison that injure the most people throughout this ecosystem. So early in summer, and again, as we look at the structure of the animal, you can see the massive shoulder hump. And so these guys are really powerful in the front end. This is one that's just early in summer. So you can see they're covered with wool. That wool will strip off largely throughout the summer. And really, they look lumbering, but they're quite agile. They can run 35 miles an hour, supposedly jump fences up to 6 feet. But they are extremely fast. And when you see them fighting with one another, it is really, really impressive when they're really going at it. So when you look at their skeleton also, you can see that the spinous processes on their vertebrae are quite long, and so that's for muscle attachment related to the legs for that pile driving ability and the front end to push through the snow and drive that head. And also it provides a support. They have specialized tendons actually which go to the base of the head, and this creates kind of that triangulation that you like to have in engineering to support that weight. So just the skull alone, a dried skull with no brain, no tissue on it, is about 60 pounds. And so by the time you add brain and fur and skin and all that, there's no telling how much that head can weigh. But anyway, they do have some specialized tendons to help support that head, and those tines have musculature associated with it as well. And that's what they need not only for pushing through snow, but for holding up that head. So again, that's going to be under this big mass here. Now, early in summer, typically what you will see are herds of females with young, and so they will bear their young in April and May, sometimes into June. And then also you'll find bachelors, either alone or in bachelor herds. But they basically are separated early in the summer. And early in the summer, the males are not very aggressive. And so if you're out hiking, they usually don't bother you too much. And then as the summer progresses, the females will begin to, or the calves will get older, and males will begin to make their ways to these herds and will start shadowing females. And so here's kind of a typical bachelor. A lot of the really big guys will wait later in the summer. They'll let the younger males move into the herds and start to try to form harems, and then they'll let them kind of fight their way through the early part of the summer, and then these big guys come in at the end and steal the harems. But the point is that through the summer, the males become progressively more aggressive. And that's something you really have to be aware of. So the males will start fighting. You'll see these jousts going on. And there can be injuries. There actually are quite a few injuries. We often see males that are limping, sometimes with puncture wounds. And then they become fodder for wolves. The wolves will take them down. So that's something I'll get back to later as well. But again, it is something you have to be aware of as you progress in summer, that the males will become very territorial. If they lose a fight, they are very aggressive. And you just got to be on your toes all the time. And I've had a single male, completely take over a valley and prevent us from hiking out. And also you may hike out into an area and be on the way back and encounter aggressive males, and you'll have to make massive detours. So if you are hiking in the area, you always want to make sure you take extra food, extra water, because you may be making some big detours if you run into one of these guys. Okay, that does it for today. I'll see you next time.